This week's episode is sponsored by the Lone Star Economic Alliance, the Texas Managed Care Alliance, and the Safer Texas Alliance. Hello and welcome to the Texas Tribune TribCast for Tuesday, May 27th, 2025. It is the last Texas Tribune TribCast of the regular session.
We did it.
We did it.
I noticed
Did we do it?
You specified regular session.
Yes.
Yeah. We will get into that
89
here
parentheses R.
soon.
Yeah.
I am Matthew Watkins, editor-in-chief of Texas Tribune. Next to me is my co-host, Eleanor Klibanoff. Hello, Eleanor.
Hey, Matthew, how are you?
And next to her is Jasper Scherer, politics reporter. Not co-host, but frequent guest and
Returning
friend
guest.
of the podcast.
Yeah.
Friend of the pod.
Favored
Yeah.
guest.
Yeah, favored guest.
I
Top
like
tier
that.
guest.
Favorite
Yeah.
guest.
How's everybody doing?
Doing well.
Tired?
Very tired.
Hanging in there, ready for Sine Die.
Yeah.
I was sad to have missed all the intense Texas A&M discussion in last week's podcast.
Oh, I actually do have some feedback I got about that episode.
Okay.
That I would like to offer the audience a mea culpa on.
Okay.
Which is that we got a lot of emails, and I'm sure I didn't respond to all of them because it's been very busy, so consider this my response. The feedback was that the average listener listening to that episode might have thought that there were only 2 institutions of higher education in Texas.
In reality, there's only one, Texas A&M.
Not helping. But
I'm the wrong
yes.
way on that.
Yeah, right. We, obviously spend a lot of time talking about UT and A&M, but we hear your feedback that, there's the Texas States and the University of Houston's, and the couple people emailed me about Rice. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about Rice, guys, because we largely cover state institutions, but we hear your feedback, and on a future episode, we'll get Kate and Jessica back to get into the weeds on those systems.
Listen, Eleanor cannot help it that all those other schools are so much more functional than A&M and UT.
Right. Yes, they just suck all the oxygen out of the room.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I have lots of takes, but I'm just going to go ahead and keep them to myself because we
Fair
don't
enough.
need to do another higher education podcast because it is May 27th, which means there is less than a week left in the legislative session. And we are officially at the point of the calendar where things are moving so fast and furious that it's hard for even me, whose job it is to keep track of these things, to keep up. Today, the 27th, is deadline for the House to pass Senate bills. Tomorrow is the deadline for the Senate to pass any bills. All that's left after that is conference committee reports, ironing out, the differences between the bills the chambers passed in different chambers. This is the time where people are tired, tensions often run high, we worry, are things going to break down? And I can think of no one better to help us talk this through than Jasper. So thank you for being here.
Of course.
We are, usually at this time going through the list of all the legislative priorities, what's happening, what's not, what is the thing that is most likely to ruin our summer vacation. And so that's the exercise I want to go through with you. Where do we stand on the big priorities? We're going to start with schools, education issues. School vouchers obviously passed a long time ago. No big issue.
Priority.
It is law. We are there. But the second step of the Texas two-step, SB 2, the school finance bill, remains somewhat up in the air, although both chambers have seemed to made somewhat of a deal here. Jasper, can you tell us a little bit about what this deal is around school finance?
Yeah, I think kind of the top line big picture summary is, both chambers got a little bit of what they wanted. It was, I think we described it in our story as kind of a face-saving compromise for both folks, in the sense that, Dan Patrick and the Senate get, a big bucket of the money narrowly targeted at teacher pay raises. And there's kind of this newly created fund that, from what I can tell, kind of replicates a lot of the functions of what the basic allotment increase would have done, kind of dedicated to helping schools pay for overhead costs, giving them some of that flexibility to pay for stuff beyond teacher pay raises, but still how do I put it, like complying with the Dan Patrick mandate, the Brandon Creighton mandate to, have more oversight, kind of tell schools what they can and can't spend their money on. So, but from what we can tell, it's $8.5 billion deal that unless there's some weird last minute hiccup, it's trending towards being signed into law.
Yeah, so let's break this down. I mean, the disagreement seemed to, in large part, be centered around how much to go into the basic allotment, which is, tell me if I'm describing this poorly, like sort of the big pot of discretionary money that the schools can spend.
Right.
Dan Patrick wanted to put less in. The House seemed to want to put more. What the compromise ended up being would be creating a new allotment for basic costs that would put $1.3 billion toward that. Kind of feels like just sort of changing the order of the words here from basic allotment to allotment for
Easy
basic
to
costs.
See how that could get mixed up a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it does, a lot of I was referring to overhead costs, the kind of the list of allowable uses for that fund, it replicates a lot of what I think the schools would have wanted to spend the basic allotment increase on: transportation, utilities, insurance cost increases, that kind of stuff.
Feels a little bit like a distinction without much of a difference.
I think so, yeah. And it does sound like the overall increase to kind of the equivalent increase of the basic allotment, even with it's going to be a $55 increase to the basic allotment, and then on top of that, even factoring in this new fund, it's still not quite, I think, what the schools were looking for, but a lot of that extra difference is going to be made up with the money going directly to teacher pay raises.
Which is $4.2 billion for
Right.
teacher pay raises, a pretty substantial increase there. To nearly $2 billion for special education, $430 million in additional school safety funds. That was a big issue last session where there were a lot of new rules and not a lot of money to spend toward them. What is the reaction of the schools on this?
I think it's been sort of a begrudging acceptance of it. $8.5 billion is a lot of money, no matter how you spin it. And I think what I've seen, it's generally positive with the caveats that they always would have liked to see more. They would have maybe liked to have a little bit more flexibility in an ideal world. But I think everyone's also just kind of breathing a big sigh of relief. You go back to 2023, the school voucher fight. This kind of a similar amount of money got caught up in was a casualty of that fight. So just, I think, big sigh of relief has been kind of the overarching response that I've seen. Yeah.
Do we feel like the big hurdle has been crossed? I mean, the big three put out a press release, all of their names, all of their quotes. There were even some Democrats in that press release. We're not done yet, right? Like, the bill has passed the House. It's going back to the Senate. They can concur on the amendments or request a conference committee. But is there anything that you're seeing in that situation right now that makes you think that this is at risk in any way?
I don't think so. No, I think this, and if I'm remembering correctly, there's so many different bills that I've been trying to track, but I think the Senate has officially signed off, so we're good to go. I think we're.
Oh, they have.
I believe so, unless I'm mixing this up with something else. But they have, Dan Patrick put out when they passed it in the Senate the other day. Dan Patrick's up on the dais making a big show of, saying, basically smacking down the haters, saying, people were accusing us of holding this hostage and complaining about what was taking so long, and sort of touting it as, you got to work through the details on this thing. And so he was taking a big victory lap, and I think everyone's considering this done at this point.
So around the same time that happened, we also saw action in the House on a THC ban, a previously skeptical House in which they voted to essentially ban the sale of any substances with, a detectable amount of THC. That will essentially, starting September 1st, completely erase what you have reported to be an $8 billion industry in this state. This is the House that last session voted to decriminalize marijuana. So we're talking about a pretty significant shift from being pretty pro-marijuana to being pretty anti anything, THC related at all.
Well, and in 2019 being open for bid,
Yeah.
on THC specifically, quite the pendulum swing.
What happened there?
Well, there's a lot going on. I mean, the kind of the two-word answer is like Dan Patrick happened. He adopts this as his, one of his top pet issues, almost 6 months ago now, and was pretty much driving the hardest bargain possible from the get-go. Made clear that he was going to go to the mat, force a special session over this, and the House. I think this was sort of a frustration of mine in reporting on this story throughout the session. It was really difficult to get a sense of where the House stood on this. Even Ken King, the State Affairs Chairman, who carried the bill throughout the session, kind of was, I think it's fair to say, a little bit all over the place, or at least was, he put out different versions of the bill that, would have regulated the industry almost to the point of extinction, and then sort of went back, and it was, maybe a little more of a permissive regulatory approach. And that was the version that got to the House floor. And Tom Alverson, another Republican state representative, brought forth an amendment that essentially reverted the bill back to the Senate ban. And to my initial point, I think the House was pretty ambivalent about this issue sort of from the get-go, and you sort of saw them falling in line with what the Senate wanted on it. And I think it was a show of Dan Patrick's sway over, kind of both chambers of the legislature in some points. So
we're seeing a lot of blowback to this, sort of anecdotally, right? I mean, I think this is not an issue that falls along partisan lines always. I mean, it sort of ensnares a lot of veterans groups are very active around this. A lot of older people who use these products sort of what they would say medicinally, not through an official medical marijuana program, but they just sort of use them that way. And so I think there's I'm hearing a lot of chatter almost is this something, is everyone else on board with this, or is this Dan Patrick's thing? Would Abbott veto something like this?
Yeah, we haven't gotten, it's been sort of radio silence from Abbott on, not just whether he'll veto it, but kind of the issue overall. He's been pretty adamant about just letting the sort of the will of the ledge dictate what happens. I do think that the kind of trying to read the tea leaves here, the other part of this equation is the expansion of the state medical marijuana program. And I think the kind of the Cliff Notes version is that the two chambers seem to have reached a deal to do a more expansive expansion than what was previously thought to be on the table. And I think that maybe slightly decreases the odds of Abbott vetoing this. The kind of the outrage meter was at its fever pitch when it seemed like we were going to have the ban and also, a less permissive expansion of medical marijuana. So I think, now that the medical program TCUP is being, seems like expanded to include chronic pain and some of the, the things that were on the table that seemed to be on the table in the House when lawmakers were deciding whether to do the THC ban. The ban was sort of sold as going in tandem with this major expansion of medical marijuana. And I think the fact that seems to be happening now, maybe Abbott just doesn't want to ruffle, feathers with Dan Patrick. I mean, he had that happen on property taxes 2 years ago, and it was a messy situation. We're kind of at this point now where all the Republicans are more or less on the same page. Everything's fine. So my money would be on no veto at this point, but I also, stranger things have happened. So.
Yeah, the twists and turns of this have been very interesting, right? Because you mentioned the kind of deal to expand the medical marijuana provision. Then you see that measure go up in the House, and there's the Senate then removes chronic pain from the list of those provisions, which then creates this whole stir. Tom Oliverson, you already mentioned, kind of tweets up against this decision. People seem to think that maybe Dan Patrick has pulled a fast one on them and, has kind of gone back on the deal. Then they come out on social media and are sort of having their little...
They have receipts saying, we never promised that.
Like that.
Yeah.
It would be quite a twist if Abbott were to then come in and veto that.
Yeah.
But it'll be interesting to see. I mean, where we land on all this will be curious because, you've seen times in different states where you had a more broad medical marijuana program, and you could basically just go find a doctor to write you a prescription and then, do that. I think Dan Patrick seems very intent on keeping that from happening in Texas.
Yeah, he was pretty clear that was like the thing that he wanted to make sure was, not part of the equation was, and he's kind of been riding that train for years now. Like if you go back to some of the comments he's made over the years, that's been his big sort of line in the sand or sticking point, that he doesn't want to open this up to anyone being able to get their doctor to write this prescription. I think also the big unexplored question is what's kind of the ripple effects of this in 2026? How big of a a backlash? I guess on both or on either side of the aisle. You guys were mentioning just some of the kind of the divided opinions on this issue within the Republican Party.
I mean, you've got farmers that are upset, you've got veterans, you've got small business owners. I think it's an example of, like, particularly in these final days of session, like, things that are happening inside the Dome feel so, of course, Abbott couldn't veto this because, like, Oliverson and Patrick struck this deal, and everyone is on board finally, and it's like, that can become so insular that it's like you sort of lose track of, like, what do people outside of this Dome want as we get into, like, the nitty-gritty of negotiating.
Right. Yeah, and this is one of those, I mean, we were talking about school finance earlier, and it's like, do people really understand and notice that, like, however much is in or not in the basic allotment determines whether I have, like, a music teacher in my elementary school or whatever. Like, there's a lot of different kind of steps you have to get to understand that. But the number of people, I don't know what that number is, but there's clearly enough of a number that it allows these stores to pop up pretty much everywhere. Yeah. Not just like in downtown Austin, but like everywhere. Rural parts of the state too, you can find these things. And starting September 1st, those stores are probably going to have to close. And that, product that they're selling will be illegal. And like in some cases, like you could get a felony charge for having it. And you've got, and it's going to be very clear who did this.
Yeah, right.
And that'll be interesting to watch. I honestly have no idea, like, how much of a political impact or penalty this will be. It might be fairly limited. And I think in defense of the Senate and of Dan Patrick for this, it was never the intent of the legislature to have all these stores pop up. When they legalized hemp, they were trying to do something very different than what they've done right now. But this will be one to watch politically.
And just on your last point, this one comment that Rafael Anchia, a state lawmaker a Democrat from Dallas, made on the floor as this THC ban debate was going on. He made the comment that essentially, we as the legislature kind of, if you're looking for someone to blame for this, it's kind of the legislature's fault for, as you say, sort of inadvertently creating this industry 6 years ago, and then basically doing nothing to step in and put some at least reasonable regulations on it in the intervening time. Really laid the groundwork for folks to come in and say we just got to get rid of it altogether. So yeah.
All right, let's take a break and hear from our sponsors. A coalition of more than 1,150 Texas job creators, citizens, and business associations is working to stabilize the insurance market by restoring transparency and fairness to Texas's courts. That's the Lone Star Economic Alliance. Learn more at www.lseatx.com. That address again, lseatx.com. The Safer Texas Alliance supports SB 3, advocating for responsible THC policies that protect public health and safety. Learn more at safertexasalliance.com. Texas Managed Care Alliance is working to protect high-quality health care for Medicaid patients, ensure accountability for taxpayer dollars, and advocate for fair and competitive contracting policies. More at www.texasmanagedcarealliance.org. That's texasmanagedcarealliance.org. Okay, so Jasper, I think one of the big topics of conversation then is Dan Patrick just getting everything he wants here? And, I think we talked about these two bills, HB2, the school finance, and the THC ban. And I think one of the big questions here is how related are these pieces of legislation? Is this a part of some kind of big deal struck between the big two? We're going to give you your THC ban if you give us a little bit more on the school finance.
Yeah, I think Dan Patrick's folks at least dispute that notion, but I think if you kind of look at the timing of when these for example, SB3, the THC ban, kind of getting increasingly postponed and delayed until sort of a trust but verify situation where the House was waiting for the Senate to take action and on approving the school finance deal. So I think clearly those backroom discussions were happening to an extent. I also think that HB2 the school finance package was always going to pass in some form anyway. I don't think anyone in either chamber really realistically saw an opportunity to go back to their school districts and say, like, we're again giving you $0. But I think kind of the timing of how all this came together, maybe certain provisions within HB2 were potentially tied to THC, but it is wild that after all this, thousands of bills, it comes down to these two completely unrelated issues. And I should say also, point of correction, going back to what we were talking about before, HB2 has passed the Senate, but the House does need to sign off on those changes. So,
okay.
Yeah.
But it seems like they've given the indication that they are
Everyone's
going to sign off on
happy.
this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. All right, but I mean, let's tick off some of the other Dan Patrick priorities. The lottery, right? He wanted to abolish the Texas Lottery Commission, move that lottery, at least temporarily, over to the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. The House voted over the weekend to do that. Film incentives passed on Sunday, increasing states' film incentives to more than $500 million. That passed the House on
And they
Sunday.
did amend the amount down, I believe it was to $300 million.
Okay.
So
Okay. Thank you for that.
a bit of a change, but still another check mark checked off.
10 Commandments in the classrooms appears poised to pass and be signed into law. Water, SB 7 passed the House yesterday in a big infusion. HJR 7, which would be the constitutional amendment directing funds to that automatically, is on the Senate calendar. I think we could probably expect that one to go through as well. I mean, if you just tick off the things that Dan Patrick has been talking about, maybe unlike any other session, it's hard to find something that he was really pushing for that is not going to become law this year.
Yeah, I think he has kind of established this pattern or habit of putting out his list of top priorities early on at the start of session, even getting out right before Greg Abbott's State of the State. So he's the first of the big three to kind of lay out his action items, and he put out 40 items this year, not including the state budget, which always kind of comes down to the end, but all the other items, I mean, there are really only a couple that are still standing out there that haven't at least been put on a House calendar, and therefore I think we can assume are dead, like ban on taxpayer-funded lobbying, letting cities and counties send their own lobbyists to Austin. I think that was one of the handful that didn't make it through, which
a measure that amazingly still has not become law, given how long conservatives.
kind of
have been
shocking with Dustin Burrows being the speaker this year, and author of the kind of I guess what critics named the Death Star bill targeting cities last session. Kind of shocking that didn't get through, but one point that was made to me I published a story kind of looking at how Patrick was getting a lot of what he wanted. I think the one point of nuance there is that, the House and Speaker Burrows they don't put out their own corresponding list to kind of, it makes it hard to do kind of an apples to apples comparison of which chamber is getting, more or less of what they want. Just if you look at, Speaker Burrows is a pretty conservative guy. The House has a much more conservative makeup this session, and the kind of the argument that, a lot of folks are saying the House has been getting rolled, or that the Senate is having their way. I think to an extent there's some truth there, but also it's kind of they're both rowing in the same direction on a lot of these things.
Right. Is the House getting rolled if it wants the same things the Senate
Exactly.
does?
Yeah.
But there is sort of also a reality that's like Dan Patrick, obviously as lieutenant governor, the House spent all this time trying to just pick a speaker. Like he gets to get out in front, he gets to set his priorities. And then the House says like, oh, well, those are kind of our priorities too. You lose a little bit of the bicameral nature of
Absolutely.
This when we just say like, well, we'll let Dan Patrick decide for both chambers.
And that is an important point too, that it's a new first-time speaker. You've got the biggest freshman class in the House since 2013. Over like 1 in 5 members in the lower chamber are folks who are still kind of like learning where the bathrooms are, learning the ropes, and that is just by nature going to cede more power to the Senate. And then on top of that, you've got a guy in Dan Patrick, who is really, he has firmly established, he has shown what he will do to make life miserable for past speakers. He's kind of in his element more so than any other session. It's a recipe for the Senate to really drive the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about a new speaker, and not only a speaker who entered the race for speaker quite late in the process,
right.
And we really didn't know for sure was going to be the speaker until
right.
the start of the legislative session.
After, we don't even, Burrows isn't even a candidate for speaker until, a bunch of low House bill numbers have been pre-filed already, so he maybe even has less of a chance to set his own agenda at that point. So
and replacing a speaker who tried to take on Dan Patrick to some extent and
exactly.
got I will briefly tell you my allegory.
Okay, let's hear it.
I have a personal anecdote that I believe represents actually a couple of themes of the legislative session, which is that yesterday, before my House shift, as true fans of the pod know, I've been getting very into playing tennis. And so I went into a tennis clinic, and there was a girl that I'd never played with before who was so good. She was she was hitting from the baseline so powerful.
It's like the Dan Patrick of the...
Some might say.
Okay, yeah.
And I kept being paired against her, and I was like, that's insane. I got to get on her side. I got to get on her team. And so I sort of I moved around so that I was standing near her when they were splitting up the teams.
I see. So you're the Dustin Burrows in this allegory.
Some might say. And then when we got on the court, she's hitting so powerfully. She's on the baseline. I'm on the service line. She sets up, hits the first shot, and it nails me directly in between the shoulder blades at full speed, which was extremely painful. And I was like, And
this is a true story.
This is legitimately something that happened
Okay.
yesterday.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got like a weird bruise on the back in between my shoulders. And I was like, oh, that feels like a metaphor.
Yeah, I see how that applies.
And then she took all the THC
Yeah,
in your
exactly.
tennis bag
Yes,
and
she-
threw it in the trash.
Right, yeah, and said, but no more property taxes. And I was like, I'll take it. I'll take it.
How far can we extend this allegory?
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
There's a long, proud history of Trib tennis players, dating back to our founder, Evan Smith, our current CEO, Sonal Shah.
Is she a tennis player?
Yeah.
Wow.
Our current editor-in-chief
Do you play tennis?
JV, had a short-lived JV tennis career. So.
Wow. Okay. So you're saying I'm being groomed to become
That's right.
CEO
That's right.
of the Texas Tribune.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. It all felt very, So yeah, I do think there's also, to some extent, a metaphor in there about the Democrats and sort of how they've strategized all of this, but certainly seems like everyone's kind of
they're the folks who are getting served to in that allegory, I guess. Or
just
I don't
standing
know.
there being like, hit it to me, and I'm getting just knocked over. Yeah.
And they seem to be the ones who seem to be trying to push the House getting rolled narrative the most, right?
I think
Jean
so.
Wu, trying to make that argument and everything there. There, of course, is another very powerful person in the Capitol, and that's Greg Abbott, who had his own set of priorities and has landed a lot of them as well. So, I mean, we mentioned a bunch of those: water, teacher pay, school choice, of course, being like his signature issue on this issue. Property tax cuts, another thing that seems, some bills already done, others well on their way to being passed. Water. And one other one that we haven't talked about yet that seems to be kind of crossing the finish line for the first time, bail reform. Tell us a little bit about that issue.
Well, that's another issue that kind of falls into the genre of stuff that was a perennial priority that just kept falling short of the finish line. Would always pass the Senate overwhelmingly, and then because it requires amending the Constitution, Republicans just could not get enough Democrats in the House on board. But the short of it is that there's a big bail package that kind of the centerpiece of it is for certain violent crimes, giving judges discretion to deny bail outright, and in other cases requiring judges to deny bail. So this was, I think Governor Abbott has spearheaded this issue, but it's also a perennial item on Dan Patrick's list of top priorities. So I think what happened here was that Democrats sort of saw the writing on the wall that it was going to happen. There were more Republicans in the House than we've had in several sessions now, so they only needed a dozen Democrats to get on board. And this is also kind of a bipartisan issue in some ways, where when this issue has come up in the past, like in 2021, there were 100 votes for it in the House, but it just happened to die when the Democrats walked out to kill the voting bill at the end of the regular session. So and then in 2023, it just ran into a deadline. So it's not really, there are, I will say, a lot more partisan issues than this in the legislature. And I think it just, the House and Senate got together earlier, I think in a much more concerted fashion to try to strike a compromise that could get at least 12 Democrats on board. And it turned out that they, I think, ended up with like 130 plus for the constitutional amendment. They did fail to get a more stringent kind of a 11th hour play to get an even more stringent version of that through over the weekend, but still I think a huge win for the Republicans on this.
Yeah, the other thing that didn't make it through this weekend was a measure that would make it, if you were an undocumented immigrant arrested, that you were not eligible for bail, period. That failed, would have required 2/3 support.
And that could still theoretically pass. I believe they've postponed that continually the deadline is still coming up, so they still do have a little bit more time to try to pass that, I believe, but it's
Not looking good.
They have postponed it enough. I think it's been a full week now that, that's what you do when you're trying to find the votes and they're not coming together. So.
Right. And do you think that's enough? Do you think that this is enough for Greg Abbott to declare victory and say, I'm satisfied with this measure?
I think so. I mean, it's something that, he can say we still have more work to do in future sessions when we come back in 2027. But I would be surprised if he, calls them back simply over this issue. But I also have not talked to the governor about this, so we'll see what happens.
All right, so one measure, Eleanor, that did not pass, really the only measure that does not seem like it's going to pass, or it has not passed at least so far, but seems highly unlikely to pass, is Senate Bill 2880, which is a bill to stop the flow of abortion-inducing drugs in the state using I'm just going to let you explain the complicated legal situation here. Tell us about the bill first, and then we'll talk about its fate.
Yeah, so this was a bill. It's authored by by Senator Brian Hughes. That is a really wide-ranging crackdown on abortion pills. It's kind of an answer to blue states that have passed shield laws that protect their providers who mail abortion pills into Texas. This is Texas's way of upping the ante on the other side. You would be allowed to sue for $100,000 anyone who manufactures, distributes, produces, or provides these pills in Texas. And it contains some very thorny legal strategies in it, sort of that Brian Hughes sort of testing the bounds of the judicial system's response to their bills. It was seeming dead. I was sort of getting it was stuck it passed the Senate. It got stuck in the State Affairs Committee, Ken King's committee, in the House. Was getting the sense that it was not moving. There was a big push from the sort of far right in the House to get it moving. They called a last minute committee meeting. They voted it out. It got stuck there again. It did not get reported to calendars and sort of missed the deadline to make it onto today's calendar. There's still optimism, I would say, among some of the anti-abortion groups, particularly those who are maybe less versed in the strictness of the deadlines, that Burroughs will come through for them in some way, or this will get saved last minute. But it seems likely it did.
All right. So let's review. We a prior TribCast, we all made our predictions about whether or not there would be a special session. I believe it was Eleanor who insisted that we make these predictions. Who remembers how they voted? Jasper?
I feel like I predicted that we wouldn't have one, but
That's right.
That is correct.
and I'm sticking with that. It seems like that's where we're going. So.
Eleanor?
I think I predicted we would, largely to be contrarian, because I think you both voted that we would not.
Right.
And I...
Well, that's what you say now. But
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, it was all a strategy. I think we will not. I think if part of a special session is like getting the, just getting, of threatening special sessions, like getting compliance, I think everyone got sort of what they wanted.
Yep.
Agreed. I believe I predicted no. I think we all feel pretty good about the fact that this is not going to happen.
See, now I'm nervous, though.
We'll see.
This feels like a thing we're going to play
Maybe we'll
back
see some
in-
like last minute impeachments that throw
Oh,
everything.
God.
Yeah,
I know. We were talking about that yesterday in the house, like how crazy it is that yesterday was basically like like how late that all came
right.
to
It's
be.
like the 2-year anniversary.
Yeah, we were talking about when SB, the tort reform bill was,
Right.
we were like, the fact that that set into motion this series of events that led us to, Mitch Little watering down the
Right.
TLR bill. It's like deep cuts.
Yeah.
All right. Well, another big milestone happening at the end of the legislative session is some job changes for both of y'all. You, Jasper, will no longer be a politics reporter, and Eleanor will no longer be a women's health reporter. Why
true.
is that, Eleanor?
I am joining the politics team to work for Jasper.
Yes, and I'll be hanging up my reporting shoes, and we'll be very excited to take the reins of the politics team, and I feel like we have a powerhouse team that we're building, and want to continue all the good coverage we've been doing this session, into the future. We're already thinking about 2026. It feels like a ways away, but with our March primary system, it will be around the corner before we know it. So I'm really excited. We've got a great team that we're building.
Yeah. Tell us about the rest of that team.
So we're bringing on Eleanor to take over the legal affairs beat that she can maybe talk a little bit about herself, but it's I think just like the perfect fit for Eleanor. She kind of pitched this, I don't know, it's just a perfect kind of transition from what you've been covering on the women's health beat for the last 3 years now. We're also bringing over Alejandro Serrano, another internal hire, to, kind of still figuring out what everyone's purviews will include, but and then we're also filling a vacancy with our DC correspondent. Stay tuned for that. But
And it looks like Kayla.
that's right. Kayla Guo will be continuing. She has done a lot of great coverage, especially of the House this session and of the bail fight that we were just talking about. So I think, just that trio of Eleanor, Alejandro, and Kayla, plus our kind of one of our maybe team MVPs, Renzo, this session, continuing to put out The Blast, our premium newsletter, politics newsletter, and then our soon-to-be-announced, hopefully, DC correspondent. It's a solid 5-person band right there.
Absolutely. It's going to be great. One other kind of internal plug, June 11th, the TribCast will be live in
Yes.
Austin from the Austin Central Library, 7 p.m. We will be digging into the impact of the legislative session on Texas schools and what to expect next school year with all these changes. So go to texastribune.org/events to get more details of that, or just show up at the library at 7 p.m. No one's going to kick you
hanging out
out.
at the library.
But we like it if people are RSVP, so
Yeah.
so do that too. And that is all for today. We will see what happens and whether our special session predictions hold up. Thank you to Jasper. Thank you to Eleanor. Thank you to our producer, Rob. And thank you to our sponsors, the Lone Star Economic Alliance, the Texas Managed Care Alliance, and the Safer Texas Alliance. We'll talk to y'all next week.